Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 29th of October 2024. Military aid video. We're going to start with Colby Badwar just totting up the amounts of monies that different countries and entities are putting towards supporting Ukraine in terms of the $50 billion overall G7 pledge to give Ukraine from a loan that will be underwritten by frozen Russian assets. So rather than Ukraine paying back these countries and entities like the EU that money, those entities will take the money from the profits from the assets that they've frozen. Now this is interesting because of the 50 billion, 20 billion is coming from the US, 20 billion from the EU, 3.6 billion from Canada, 3 billion from Japan, and 3 billion from the UK. That's interesting to me because the US is paying way more than I thought they would. Bearing in mind that these payments are being underwritten by frozen Russian assets, and I was under the impression that actually the US didn't have as many frozen Russian assets as one might have intuitively thought they would. The EU has a vast majority locked up in Euroclear in Belgium, and actually I thought Japan had quite a bit as well. UK a lot, and Canada there seems a pretty healthy number as well. So interesting that the US and EU are doing the same amount there. I actually thought the EU was doing more than 20 billion. I thought it was 35, but interesting. Anyway, that's the different amounts as according to Colby Badwar. All funds are being dispersed no later than December 2027, but could be much sooner than that. The Biden administration intends to disperse all of their share by the end of the president's term. Holy cow. So the US amount will be going from what will be going from now until January. That's exactly what Ukraine will be wanting, that's for sure. Okay, I told you yesterday that, sensibly, Zelensky had visited Iceland to meet with the Nordic leaders at the Nordic summit there. And this is an incredibly important set of countries because they have huge support for Ukraine. Nordic states and the Baltic states are unwavering in their support. So he was in Reykjavik in Iceland, meeting with President Halla Tomasdottir. They discussed Iceland's participation in the Mine Action Coalition and in the training of Ukrainian sappers, rehabilitation of wounded soldiers, and the involvement of Icelandic companies in prosthetics. That's interesting. Iceland doesn't have an army, so it's very limited in the way that they can support Ukraine. So obviously, in all the ways they can, very small economy, etc., they are helping out in these coalitions. That's good. So Zelensky said, "I am grateful to Denmark and other partners who invest in the production of arms in Ukraine." So remember, I always talk about Denmark because they've kind of exhausted the amount that they can support Ukraine by sending their own equipment from their own weapons industry, their own arms industry. And so the next best thing for them is to support the Ukrainian arms industry. So they've got a bunch of money to put towards Ukraine. If they can't invest it in Denmark, then invest it in Ukraine rather than a third-party country. And then that helps Ukraine in ways that are more than just the equipment that that they can produce themselves. They are employing people. They're getting tax revenue. They're keeping that expertise in Ukraine. They have something that they can do R&D on and then maybe export out into the wider world. So that's a really positive way of helping Ukraine. And Denmark have been the kind of leaders there. So he's thanked them. Zelensky thanked them very explicitly on account of this. The production of arms in Ukraine, artillery shells, drones, everything that allows Ukraine to defend itself despite any logistical delays on the part of partners or changing political moods in world capitals. In other words, if Denmark change the political party and have an election there, it's not going to affect that investment they've already made in the Ukrainian arms industry. Whereas, you can imagine November time in the US, there will potentially be a huge change of approach to the support of Ukraine. And so if they can kind of ring fence that support in investment in their own defense industry, then it gives them a sustainable approach to to prevailing in the war. Norway announces a new aid package for Ukraine worth 500 million euros. That's huge, especially for a country that size. Says Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre. Of this, 350 million is allocated for military support. Incredibly important. That's awesome. Sweden will provide Ukraine with an aid package worth 63 million euros. Or dollars, sorry. This money will be used to purchase air-to-air missiles for F-16s, training of Ukrainian marine infantry battalions, and the purchase of demining equipment. Sweden is to allocate $68 million, as Kiev Independence says, 63 there from Max 23, so one or the other. About 46.5 million will go towards initiatives supporting Ukrainian armed forces. Swedish government said another 21.6 million towards the defence industry development, so a similar thing possibly there to Denmark. So that's Sweden. So that's how important going to these summits is for Zelensky and for Ukraine. He's just relentlessly going about his work. Now, Croatia, this is a Ringtausch thing that looks really, really good for Ukraine. Croatia will transfer 30 T-84 tanks and 30 M80 BMPs to Ukraine. In return, Germany will pay Croatia for part of the Leopard 2A8 tanks that they are due to provide. Okay, so no report says Croatia plans to acquire 50 new German Leopard 2A8 tanks. So not the 2A8. Did I say 2A4? 2A8. So brand new Leopard tanks. Reports Jutarnyi list. Today, Defence Ministers Ivan Anušić and Boris Pistorius will sign a letter of intent in Berlin. Under the deal, Croatia will send these 30 M84, which are improved T-72M tanks, and 30 M80 IFVs, similar to the BMP-1, so those are pretty old, to Ukraine. Germany will compensate Croatia for these vehicles, reducing the cost of the Leopard 2A8 tanks. Okay, German aid to Ukraine has got talked about this as a Ringtausch. And then John P., who does the counting up of these deep storage bases around Russia, has chimed in and said it's late 2024 and we're still doing Ringtausch. So Ringtausch is where you get equipment from one country to Ukraine by providing that country with stuff. So Germany here is essentially the one providing the vehicles from Croatia to Ukraine. This is a German initiative. It's not like you might congratulate Croatia, but it's not really congratulating Croatia. It's like Germany saying, we'll let you off a bunch of money for these Leopard 2A8s you've ordered if you give Ukraine all that stuff. So Croatia gives Ukraine all that stuff. That is Germany doing this. So this is Germany, again, being at the forefront of getting serious aid to Ukraine. We can complain about Olaf Scholz and we can complain about Tauruses, but empirically, Germany is doing a frick of a lot of heavy lifting at the moment. And we must remember that. They get a bit of a bum rap, really, from people because mainly of Taurus and restrictions on weapons going deep into Ukraine, which is, that's justified. That's not to say that we shouldn't be criticising. We should be criticising for that because that's annoying. But don't let that colour your entire sense of what Germany's doing here, which is actually really decent. So here's another example. Anyway, John P. then says, look, it's late 2024 and we're still doing these Ringtausch deals instead of buying Leopard 2s directly for Ukraine. So John P. saying, well, instead of letting them off money for Leopard 2A8s, why not put some orders in for Leopard 2A8s for Ukraine? And actually, there's a bit of debate that goes on here, and I'm going to talk you through it because it is important to understand that actually that's a bad idea. The amount of money Leopard 2A8s would cost and the amount of other stuff you can get for that, give them the other stuff. Because A, they can use that straight away. B, you don't have to build it and make it. And C, it's actually not a very good use of that amount of money. If you're going to buy them the very best Leopard tanks, then they are going to be crazy expensive. And they're not going to last conceivably that much longer than an upgraded Leopard 1 or a much older Leopard 2 or an older Abrams tank or whatever. So Jakub Janowski says these Leopard 2A2s will be delivered in years, likely 5+ from now, while the equipment for at least most of it will be that they will be replacing can be sent quickly to Ukraine. That's the first argument. John P. then replies, that doesn't change at all what I said. You can give Ukraine older equipment while at the same time ordering new equipment for them. It's just that the latter hasn't happened at all, and they will come when not only Russian military stockpiles are gone. So Jakub Janowski then replies, ordering that equipment for us is more pragmatic when deliveries are that far out. If some ally, Ukraine or someone else, needs them, then when they will be delivered, we can redirect them at that time. And our armies also need that new equipment, and we need some equipment just for training so that our troops don't lose important skills, etc., etc., etc. And so it went on. And German aid to Ukraine just adds in at the end here, and I think this is really important. Can confirm that Ukraine prefers modern infantry fighting vehicles. I talked about this in the earlier video today, that actually they prefer Bradleys to tanks because Bradleys are much more versatile. They're decent. The armor's pretty good. They can fire the tow missiles on top at a really accurate and a pretty good range, although they're not fire and forget. They're optically wired and connected, but they're still pretty good. And they've got that Bushmaster autocannon on top that can do some serious damage. They can carry people. They're quicker, more maneuverable, just more useful for the Ukrainians than a main battle tank. So, can confirm that Ukraine prefers modern IFVs over modern main battle tanks, as IFVs are much more needed on the battlefield. Kamishin, Top Knot guy, talked about this regarding Lynx and Panthers a while ago. So they are making Lynx infantry fighting vehicles in Ukraine. Rheinmetall are making them in Ukraine, and that's what they want to go for. They don't want the tanks. I mean, of course, I guess they would like everything, but if you're going to have to choose, if you've got a finite amount of money, spend it on IFVs. Also, we shouldn't forget how expensive, let's say, 100 Leopard 2A8 are, around 2.8 billion euros. Try to find a country willing to pay so much money and still deliver other military aid to Ukraine. The only countries who possibly invest so much money for Ukraine are the US and Germany, and even for us it's too much money, as it would seriously limit our deliveries of other military aid in the future. However, donations or cheap purchases from US stocks shouldn't be an issue if both parties really want to. In other words, if you really want main battle tanks, there's an absolute ton of Abrams over in the US. And we've got some older Abrams coming from Australia, which is cool, 49 of those. But you've got some much newer Abrams that the Americans have huge stockpiles of. So rather than put in big orders for brand new Leopard 2A8s, there are better options. Other option, of course, is for Ukraine to use a $50 billion loan for a larger contract, but they will, of course, not see those deliveries for at least 2 years. So I think that was an important conversation to relay to you there. But the end result is that the Ukrainians are going to receive 30 main battle tanks and 30 infantry fighting vehicles. So that's all good stuff there. I don't know how upgraded they will or won't be. Now, good news as well. France has equipped one brigade and we have an agreement for another. So the Minister of Armed Forces, Sébastien Lecornu, has recently expressed his wish to equip another brigade in the same format as a regenerative brigade, the Anne of Kiev Brigade. Zelensky just confirmed an agreement to train and equip a second brigade. This is really good news, and you can read. Okay, so Volodymyr Zelensky said, "We're now in the third year of full-scale war, and our soldiers on the front lines need renewed strength. That's why we are urgently working to equip our brigades. We are already partnering with others. France has equipped one brigade, and we have an agreement for another. We invite you to join us in building a Scandinavian brigade." So he was just over meeting those Nordic countries. This, you can imagine, would have been part of the discussion. Demonstrating your continued commitment to Europe's defence. I'm grateful to Denmark and other partners investing in our weapons production, as we heard earlier. That's a quote from earlier. We see Putin is ramping up his arms production, and rogue regimes like Pyongyang are aiding him. Next year, Putin aims to match the EU's production of munitions. We must act now to prevent. That's why I urge you to increase your investment in weapon manufacturing in Ukraine, particularly long-range missiles and drones, key tools for diminishing Russia's capabilities. I also urge you to invest in purchasing artillery ammunition from third countries for our soldiers, as this will greatly help on the front lines. Now, that is, of course, referencing the sort of Czechia initiative, the Czech initiative. Our team will provide you with all the necessary details about countries that can supply this ammunition. I also urge you to continue developing your own industries, producing everything needed for defence, including sensitive items like microchips. Europe needs industrial strength and independence from other parts of the world. And this is absolutely true. There's very much a need for Europe to be doing this anyway, to safeguard its own national or intranational security going forward. We need to stop Putin's investments in war. The shadow fleet allows Russia to bypass sanctions, earning billions of dollars, and poses a serious imminent threat to the environment as well as a rules-based international order. He says, without access to your territorial waters, a significant part of Putin's tankers are worthless. Let's act on this, and I am especially addressing Denmark. We need a strong strategy based on the general principles of the international maritime law, the legal framework governing the Danish Straits, and the obligations to protect the environment. So, of course, when you've got all this shipping going from St. Petersburg out of Russia with these shadow cargo boats, shadow vessels, then Denmark has a lot to say about that. There's a lot of power there that the Nordic nations can have over Russia's ability to generate funding for the war. Invitation to NATO. Principles always mean clarity, knowing what you believe in, keeping promises and standing by your words. Ukraine has long been told that we have the same rights as any other democratic nation in Europe, but is this really the case? We're not talking about NATO membership for Ukraine right now, and this is super important. So this whole thing about, we can't invite Ukraine into NATO, it's like, it's not that we want to be in there now, but we need some kind of route, a pathway, a bridge to NATO that is formal, that would happen as soon as the war is over type thing. We're not talking about an invitation to join NATO, a political decision that would bring geopolitical clarity we're only talking about, an invitation to join NATO. That would bring geopolitical clarity for Ukraine and all of Europe and strengthen us in diplomacy with Russia when the time comes for the second peace summit, when that happens. So in other words, give us that invitation. Let's get this on the table. Like, it's not that we're going to be part of NATO tomorrow. We want an invitation. And he says it's clear why an invitation to NATO is not the same as full membership in the alliance. Yet some leaders speak of it as if it were. They are asked about an invitation, but they respond only about membership. This isn't fair. It's simply a way of saying no. This is a really, really important point. Ukraine deserves an honest answer, and I ask you to support this transparency. Please work with partners across Europe, especially in Berlin, so that we can achieve this geopolitical clarity together. When Ukraine receives an invitation to NATO, it will become an unbreakable defensive wall against Russia's imperial ambitions. Russia must end its aggression, and that begins abandoning its ambitions over Ukraine. And that begins with abandoning its ambitions over Ukraine. Everything I've outlined is part of the victory plan, along with other key measures essential for our defence, deterring Russia, strengthening economic cooperation, implementing further sanctions against Russian aggression, and more. I urge you to support this document and implement its points, etc., etc., etc. So that's, I think, good reasoning there from Zelensky. Now, going back to the French support for training Ukrainians, or in training Ukrainians and equipping those brigades as well. It's not just about training them. It's like 2,500 people all kitted up, like trained, kitted up with all of this stuff. And this is a useful infographic, actually, that gives you an idea of what's gone on with the 155th Brigade that the French have trained up. And here, because I've been wondering about the tanks, here they're listed on this infographic, and I don't know about the provenance of this, Stevius, whoever that is, but Leopard 2A4s are part of this. So you've got 31 of these. There were some rumours that Leclerc tanks might be a part of the initiative because they've kind of disappeared off an inventory list in the same way that I think some AMX 10 RCs did previously, and then they suddenly ended up being in Ukraine. Or I don't know if it's that, maybe another piece of kit, but you get the point that there is form for the French doing that, and then that kit turning up in Ukraine. Well, if that's happened with the Leclerc tanks, could it be that the French unit is receiving French tanks? That'd be really interesting. Anyway, they've got these Caesars, they've got the VABs that the French are phasing out, and they've given the Ukrainians first dibs on all of them. Same, I think, with the AMX 10 RCs. Basically, they're phasing those out, and their principle is to give Ukraine the ability to refuse them first before selling them off elsewhere outside of France. Okay, so interesting that the French are, it appears, going to do that again. Good stuff there. North Korean arms sales to Russia estimated to be up to $5.5 billion worth of equipment. Both countries do not publish official statistics on their bilateral trade, yet the study reads that even the minimum estimates are over 1.7 billion. So probably about 5.5 billion, but somewhere between 1.7 billion and more. That is really good news for Russia, as they are doing brisk business with another dictatorship around the world. Of course, that's $5.5 billion worth of kit that is going to Russia and then into Ukraine to be used against Ukrainians. This is a real issue. Now, the Pentagon today, as I mentioned in my previous video, have confirmed, or yesterday, that there will be no new restrictions on Ukraine's use of US weapons if North Korean forces engage in combat against Ukrainian troops. And I agree with this in the principle of giving or laying down these red lines that Russia shouldn't cross, and if they do cross, then there are these consequences. I just don't understand the use of new here. In fact, we have it so US won't impose new restrictions on Ukraine's use of American weapons if North Korea joins war, says the Pentagon. Quote, a portion of those soldiers have already moved closer to Ukraine, said Sabrina Singh. But yeah, what does it mean by new? And that's a question. Control F, new. Let's have a look at new. Okay. Well, it doesn't really say. The article says nothing more about new. No one else appears to be talking about how problematic that wording is. Surely it should be the existing. We will not introduce new restrictions. Yeah, but no one's talked about extra restrictions that you could introduce. What about the ones that already exist? What we care most about, what the Ukrainians care most about, is the ability to use ATACMS and Storm Shadows and Scalps deep into Russia that you, the US, are presently stopping. That's an old restriction. That red line should be about the old restriction. So I'd be interested in if anyone could give me any clarity on this wording. So again, here we just got, they don't really talk about this United 24 article, doesn't either talk about the idea of new and what that can mean. Finally, good news is that Israel have helped out Ukraine. I don't think intentionally, particularly. It's kind of a happy bit of collateral there. But Israeli airstrikes on Iranian military targets on the night of October the 26th could deprive Russia of Iranian weapons that the Kremlin is buying for its war in Ukraine, according to the Moscow Times. So Israel leaves Putin without Iranian ballistic missiles. So you remember they took out all the S-300 and S-400 radar systems, and I don't know whether the launchers were as well, but it allowed the Israeli jets to fly an awful long way, and that included refueling in order to do what they did in attacking recently. They had to refuel. So it's a big old mission that they did, and then struck key targets inside Iran. One thinks were drone and possibly drone, but ballistic missiles, missile facilities. That obviously helps Israel because Iran won't be able to fire those into Israel, but actually they won't be able to sell them to Russia for Russia to use into Ukraine. Good news though there, if that is true for Ukraine. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thank you for watching. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.